This is the science of IVF and fertility and IVF, and what I'm trying to, obviously you get the idea, I'm not advocating for IVF tonight. But what we're dealing with here is really how human fertility works and that sort of thing. Let's go on to the second slide. Now, in normal human reproduction, most women have about 500,000 eggs when they're born. I don't know if you ever knew that or not. It's true, 500,000, that's a lot. And most have the potential to mature, but not all will fully ripen. So then you get to the time of menopause, and by like age 50 or so, there are no healthy ova left at that point, and then it just stops. So the way that it works, ripe ovum are gathered from the follicles by the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube is about 15 centimeters long. The ovum rolls over the surface of the membrane while it awaits the sperm. And so it does that. The ovum moves down the fallopian tube, being propelled by cilia, and the liquid in the fallopian tube washes away nutrient cells until it arrives to the wider outer part of the fallopian tube where it can be fertilized. I'm giving you details here just to say that this is how it works. When it gets to that point in the fallopian tube, it has 24 hours to fertilize. If it does not do that, it degenerates and then moves down, and then menstruation happens about 2 weeks later. So that's the process of the creation of the eggs. And so when you actually have the sperm meeting the egg, let's go on to the third slide. When you go on to this next slide here, that's what you have as a picture. You've got a picture there of a fertilized egg, a successfully fertilized egg. As I mentioned in the first session, at that moment, you have a human life. It's alive. It's a different stage of development, but it's no less human, and it's no less life. And so once you establish that fact, that's where all of it gets very difficult when it comes to ethics, morality, and when we're talking about what happens in vitro fertilization under glass. So at this point, though, we're talking about regular human reproduction. So at this stage on day 1, it's a zygote. It's called a zygote. On day 2, it will split again, and then you've got 4 cells. Day 3, it's 8 cells, and then it starts picking up the pace. Around day 4 and day 5, you get to like to 16, and then to 32 cells, and then by day 5, you've got an early blastocyst. By day 6 to 9, you've got blastocyst implantation there in the uterine wall, and at that point, you've got this pregnancy, you've got a human life that has implanted. It has survived the earliest stages, made it through those first steps and stages, and you have that beginning of the pregnancy. Let's go on to the next slide, the fourth slide. And so here we've got the blastocyst, it's showing a blastocyst there. About 24 hours after fertilization, the first cell division will take place in the zygote. We already mentioned that. The fertilized egg will remain in the fallopian tube for 3 or 4 days as it's dividing. And what's really cool, it's amazing how God has worked these things out. The narrowest portion of the fallopian tube opens, and the ovum passes quickly into the uterus at that point. And then the egg will shed its outer wall. That blastocyst that you see on the screen expands, makes contact with the uterine wall. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, we're there. On that slide, you have that's a picture of a embryo that is attached to the uterine wall. That's the actual. It's not artistic rendering. That's a photo. 3 weeks after fertilization, the blastocyst has become an embryo, and the first nerve cells begin developing. So that's a crash course, very quick overview of what happens with normal human reproduction in the earliest stages of human development. So let's move on to the next slide. Yep, we were there. Why is it unethical? The very first point is that life begins. I hope it matches my notes. Let's see. Okay, well, this is again the process. This is the process of IVF. I'm going to do this so I can see what I'm doing. There we go. Sorry I got my back sort of turned to you, but there we are. In IVF, by contrast and comparison, you have the ovaries stimulated. When they come to the clinic, they'll go and they'll pay that when they begin the cycle, they will overstimulate the ovaries to produce many eggs because it's a numbers game. The more eggs you produce, the better chances you have to actually have a child. And so they'll do that in the first step. They retrieve these eggs, and usually you might get 8 to 14 in a normal cycle. It may or may not happen that way, but 8 to 14 is the range. Those eggs are fertilized. Once they're fertilized, some of those eggs are going to die by attrition. That happens in normal human reproduction all the time. There's times when you have a embryo that's been created in your ladies in your womb. You've got that happening, fallopian tube, but it doesn't survive. It doesn't implant for any number of reasons, and so they die by attrition as well. That does happen in regular fertilization. The difference is that in normal human reproduction, you just don't know about that. You didn't, and the other thing is you didn't sign a contract and you didn't pay $10,000. You're not aware of that situation. In IVF, some of those embryos, those 8 to 14, will die by attrition. I think they figure something like a third of them might die by attrition. Others that do survive past that stage, earliest stage, will not grade high enough to meet the clinic standards for viability. So they grade the embryos when they're creating them under glass. They'll do pre-genetic screening, PGS. They'll do that and test it. Later on, they'll test test PGT, some other things. And they're testing to see in these stages a couple of things. Do they have any genetic markers for things like Down syndrome? Do they have genetic markers for things like cystic fibrosis? Those sorts of things. If they have those markers, they're not going to grade very highly on the clinic scale. And if they don't meet the top 2 grades, they are discarded or they are donated to science. All right, great, thank you. Better, that'll work. So, off to the side a little bit. They will not grade high enough. And then what they'll do at that point, when you have the ones that have passed these tests, they will either transfer the embryos that have graded well. They'll usually transfer 1 or 2 these days. There were times when they would transfer more than that, maybe 3. Sometimes that still happens. Sometimes they were doing as many as 5. They're doing less of that now. They're trying to bring it down a little bit so it's more ethical. And they'll transfer a couple, and some of those that transfer don't survive. It's common that transferred embryos don't survive. The rest that they haven't transferred that have successfully passed the clinic's grading are frozen in cryogenic storage, and there's a certain percentage of those that are frozen that don't survive thaw. So when they go to transfer those frozen ones later, they don't survive thaw, and then they die. Let's go on to the next slide. At that point, after they've been transferred, and you actually have successfully transferred, and now they're beginning to develop in the womb as a fetus, you'll have cases where they will go back and they'll test and see, do we have, they test before they do all that, but they test again when there are other markers for any, like Down syndrome and other sorts of diseases. If they find markers for those things as late as the 2nd trimester of pregnancy, they do what's called selective reduction. That's just a fancy word for an abortion. And so what we have here, this is the first slide. This is what happens when you do a selective reduction. This is showing one side of the fetus and a placenta. Let's go ahead to the next slide. And that you see there to the right, it's a little bit small, so you can't quite see, but that's a fetus in the 2nd trimester. And so what they do is they take a needle, they inject, and they do a abortion that way. They inject the baby that they don't want to have with a drug that stops the baby's heart. And it's as bad as you can imagine when you describe it. You see them suffer and struggle and die. You're doing an abortion, in the first or second trimester with a baby in the womb, and you're doing it, and they've done it for reasons other than even Down syndrome and all those things. They'll do it if it's a boy and not a girl, or a girl and not a boy, things like that. And so selective reduction, they're trying to do less of this, but they're still doing it. And so this is the reality of IVF, especially like in the state of New York, where obviously abortion's really not an issue as far as the government's concerned, things like that. And so this is part of the process, for not every process, obviously, but this does happen way more than you want it to. What happens is, after that happens, sometimes the baby that has died will dissolve in the womb, but often it will mummify essentially. And this is what this is. This was a baby that was selectively reduced that was delivered at the same time as a living baby was delivered. And this is how it happens. When they mummify, that's what happens. You have a live baby and you have a dead baby. And I have a friend who she knew somebody who has done this, and she was just traumatized by it. You have this beautiful baby, and they bring out this dead baby that you agreed to reduce. So it's horrible. Let's move on to the next. So how many of you have seen this? Have seen Build a Baby by Choice for Two? A few of you have seen it. So I'll go ahead and we'll show it, since most of you haven't.
Welcome to Build a Baby, where anyone who wants a baby can build one. Something broken? Missing an ingredient or two? In our state-of-the-art facility, using state-of-the-art technology, we can build your state-of-the-art baby. Starting with the swimmers. If you've got a sperm producer, you'll be quite comfortable in our semen collection room, where you'll find everything you need to perform the task at hand. No sperm producer? No problem. Build your baby with our extensive donor sperm bank, where all our donors meet the highest human standards. Now, on to the eggs. As with the sperm, if you're missing an egg carrier, you'll have full access to our egg donation bank, all gathered from top specimens. But if you do have an egg carrier, we'll pump that sucker full of hormones, so you can get as many eggs as possible in the shortest amount of time.
And then the true magic begins. Building a baby in a petri dish. Truly a miracle.
All embryos will be graded, and we'll discard any defective or genetically imperfect babies before you even know it. Building a baby shouldn't make you feel guilty. Congratulations! You're the proud parents of multiple embryos. Now all that's left is the womb. Are you a womb carrier? Get ready to party. No womb? No worries. Our womb rental managers will find the perfect match for your baby building. At long last, the day has come. Embryo transfer day. Cross your fingers that an embryo will stick, and you'll get that one perfect baby. Or 2, or 3, or 8. Not to worry, selective reduction will take care of that. Wondering what happens to your Build-A-Babies that we don't transfer? For a small fee, we'll store them in our top-of-the-line cryogenic freezers, ready for you to try again, or discard, or donate, or give to science. A beautiful gift. But whatever happens, Build-A-Baby is happy to help you again, and again, and again, no matter the cost. Contact us and build your baby today.
All right, so obviously this is satirical, right? But what we're trying to do is just show baseline IVF. Obviously, not all this happens with all of IVF, but there is a lot of this idea of building a baby, where you can go to a fertility clinic and you can look at the eggs and see who donated the eggs. And you can see how old the supplier of the egg is. How old is she? What does she look like? Sometimes they have pictures, or they'll just describe. Say, well, she brown hair, brown eyes, whatever, blonde hair, blue eyes, and you've got that information that's there with the egg. Same for the sperm, the donor of the sperm. You can sometimes have what professions they're involved in will be listed along with that. I've seen the emails. I've actually seen these descriptions. And so you have this thing going on with this, where there's an element of eugenics that's going on with this. And so even with the whole testing for Down syndrome, today, by the way, I don't know if you know this, today is World Down Syndrome Day. Just happens to be. And over in Iceland, they brag because they've gotten rid of Down syndrome in Iceland. Well, the reason is because they do this genetic testing. And if anybody gets pregnant and has a Down syndrome child, they just kill the baby. Genetically, if you're dealing with IVF, they're going to wipe it out that way. If they find out after they're pregnant, they just wipe them out that way. More murder, more child sacrifice on behalf of the nation of Iceland, I guess. And so I'm making the case that Build a Baby kind of overviews that, but IVF is unethical for these reasons. Let's go ahead and hit that. Life begins at fertilization. Again, once you establish that fact, it's from there you have a human life. What do you do with that human life? Who's accountable for that human life? And I'm saying that if you sit down and you sign a legal document and you pay money to create the human life, and then you go through a process where you are reducing the human life, or even the human life dies by attrition, that human life's never created without that legal document or that payment of money. Who's accountable for that? Before God. I mean, who's accountable for that? In any other court of law for any other thing, with a signed document and you paying the money, you're involved. Now, you have people that will object, well, no, this happens also. Dying by attrition happens in the normal course of things. Yeah, but you're dealing with one at a time. One at a time in that case. Here you're creating many, and you agreed to that. Let's go on to the next one. The process of gathering sperm, it's alluded to in Build a Baby. Doesn't always have to be that way. I understand that. You hear that objection. I didn't look at porn in order to get the sperm. Well, maybe you didn't, but a lot of IVF clinics have a place for you to go to take care of that part of the process. Guy that we talked to out in front of the clinic one day said, yeah, they lock you in a closet and you just come out with your sperm. Now they have on your iPhones, you don't need a room full of porn, but that is how they did it before. And so you have an ethical issue there. You're like Jesus said, you look with lust, you commit adultery. So that's just part of it. It's a calculated process of human sacrifice to get I'll add the word nearly, the nearly genetically perfect child that's wanted. The testing that they go through is to eliminate all possibility that there's going to be some sort of disease or something like that that could be negative somewhere down the road. That's eugenics. And what you're trying to do is get as perfect an embryo as you can possibly do. That is eugenics. That is what it is by definition. And so it's that. The amount of bloodshed is very nearly incalculable. And I say it's incalculable because they literally, the fertility clinics do not keep count of how many embryos were created in any given cycle, and they're not keeping count of the discards or the donations to science. So we really don't know exactly, but we can calculate based on cycles versus live births. So if you look at the Centers for Disease Control, the fertility clinics will report their cycles and live births to the Centers for Disease Control, and you can look at specific clinics. You could do that with the CNY Fertility right here in Buffalo if you wanted to do that. We did that in Texas, in Bedford, at Center for Assisted Reproduction. Their numbers work out to 4 cycles for every 1 live birth. So if you got 8 to 14 that are fertilized, then you have a certain number, you can start to extrapolate over 4 cycles to 1 live birth, maybe how many you might be dealing with. And so, yeah, it is eugenics referred to that. Reproduction, I've said it before, is intended for marriage. What you're doing with IVF, you're inviting other parties into the marriage bed, essentially, in order to create human life. Where the sperm is deficient, they will look for another sperm donor. Where the egg is deficient, they'll look for another egg. You're inviting other people, basically, into the marriage bed in order to create human life. And I'm talking baseline IVF. And I've already referred to it a little bit. We'll talk more about it tomorrow. IVF is often idolatrous. When you get to a point, speaking mainly here to Christians, when you get to the point where this matters more than anything, even the number of human lives you sacrifice to get the child that you want, you have an idolatry issue where you want that thing more than all the ethical ramifications, more than what God has clearly revealed in what you would say natural theology and even in his word. You've got an idolatry issue. This is an idea that I sort of came up with out in front of an IVF clinic one day while I was preaching out there. I will preach in front of IVF clinics like I've done in front of abortion clinics. And based on the idea of 4 cycles to every one live birth, I kind of came up with this number. You could have like 25 to 30 human lives created for every one live birth. So just think about that for a second. 25 to 30. So the illustration I came up with is, imagine that a bus comes up alongside this, the street there in front of the clinic, and the driver invites you to come on the bus and pick a kid out. So you go through the bus, 25 or 30 to 30 on the bus, and you look at them, hair color, eye color. You maybe try ask them questions about what does your mom do? What does your dad do? Ask them a few questions to see how smart they are, whatever. And you're going through and you're trying to find out what's the best kid on the bus, the one that I want for my son, for my daughter. And you pick the one, and you walk to the front of the bus with the one, and you turn to the bus driver and you say, I got the one that I want. You can do what you want with the rest. And he goes in the back and he kills them all. This is just an illustration to help us, because what do? We look at the other pictures that we saw earlier in this presentation, and they look a lot different than us. These embryos look very different from us. A zygote looks a lot different from us. A blastocyst looks a lot different from us. And we look at that and we go, well, that's not really human life. But technically, it is certainly, number one, human. It is not a frog, right? It's not a giraffe. It's a human, categorically. Secondly, it's alive. How do you know it's alive? It's dividing. The cell division, where it goes from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells to 60 to 32, that is life. It doesn't do that if it's dead. So this isn't rocket science. It's embryology. You have human life. Because it's in a different stage of development from where we are, we have this tendency to think it doesn't matter as much. That's dangerous. Because human stages of life continue well after you're born. You thought about that? Like, I'm thinking about it. I'm 53. I'm getting to that stage of human development that's known as elderly, right? So when you get to that stage of human development, what are you going to do with them? Talk to Canada. Talk to the UK. What are they doing? They're killing them. Why? Assisted suicide. Whatever they're doing it. See, remember I said earlier about our culture being built on sacrifice, human sacrifice? Why are we doing it at that stage? They're a drain on society. Oh. So now what matters is the collective. What is that? Getting to communism, right? Like, we will wipe people out if they don't benefit us. We'll sacrifice them so that we can do better without them. They're made in the image of God. That's murder. So we have to connect the dots on these things. So if you look at a blastocyst and go, well, it's not viable. Are you viable after you're born? I mean, you are dependent completely on someone else for a while after you're born, right? When you're elderly, you might be dependent on someone else for a while. Does that make you less human? See, we have to connect the dots. We have to think it through. And that's all I'm trying to do with this. So now I want to I know this is a crash course, and I'm trying to go quickly, but so I want to show you this video. I know it's about an 8-minute video, so you have to be a little patient with this. But this is us standing in front of the IVF clinic in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is a discussion that I have with a guy who's gone through it a few times and has children by IVF. And so what I call this is how to walk a fine line between standing for embryos and getting punched in the face, or you better be prayed up or else. So I don't mean this to like scare you off or whatever, but what I'm trying to show you with this is the objections that come when you're standing out in front of an IVF clinic with people who are actually doing it, okay? And how do you talk to them? And I'm being very forceful here. I am far less forceful when I'm standing in front of an IVF clinic. You'll see it here. And the thing you got to keep in mind when you're just talking to people about this, or strangers, if you're going to stand out in front of an IVF clinic, always, is that a soft answer turns away wrath. And so watch this, and we'll talk after. That's some free information.
What's that?
Free information.
Free information on what?
IVF.
On IVF?
Yep.
I just walked out of the clinic,
Yeah.
so I got a pretty good idea what it is.
Yep. So you're doing IVF then? They do several things here.
Yeah, we are.
Okay. How far along are you, if I can ask?
I'm on child number 2.
Okay. So you've done it once before.
Yeah.
Okay. Have they? Do you have any in the freezer right now?
I do.
How many?
A bunch.
A bunch. Okay, that's all I need to know. So I wouldn't know anything, honestly. So have you thought?
Oh, you did though, because you asked the question.
I did.
Yeah.
So
you did need to know. For what you're wanting to do here, you did need to know.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
Right, so I got a bunch.
Okay.
So what about it?
So I'm just asking if you've thought through what you'll do with all.
Yeah,
all
we
of
have.
them.
We've
Okay.
discussed it, and that's none of your business.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, we've discussed it.
Are you upset with me?
Huh?
Are you upset with me?
I'm upset that y'all have harassed my wife.
When did I do that?
I didn't say that you did. I said y'all, didn't I?
Okay. When did any of us do that?
I would bet that she'd say that at least one of the 4 of y'all have been out here
Okay.
when she's been here.
All right. No one is ever harassed out here.
Okay.
So that's why we film everything, is to show
No,
that.
that's fair.
Okay. Because people will accuse us of all kinds of stuff. I used to do this in front of abortion clinics and used to have the cops called out regularly and
Right.
all that. We have to do something to make sure that we have a record of what we're doing. So we've never harassed your wife or anybody, for that matter, out here.
Okay.
So that's fair.
So would you like to continue?
Yeah.
Or,
What would you like to say?
what do you want to say?
Well, I'm
Because you're
just-
the one out here to say something.
Yeah, I'm just asking.
So I'm curious what you have to say.
Okay.
Because I haven't been in each time that she's told me people have been out here.
Okay.
So that's why I stepped out.
I appreciate
Because I was
you.
curious what you were going to say
Yeah.
to me.
Okay. So I could just tell you what we say. As I ask people, like I've already asked you, what are your plans for the embryos that are in storage? Are you planning on having them implanted? Are you planning on having them adopted out? Because we believe that life starts at fertilization. That's what the scientists say, and so those are human lives.
Right.
And so obviously
Those are my children.
those are your children. I'm glad you're saying that, because not everybody in the IVF world anyway, like the doctors, things like that, they don't necessarily always say that. So I'm glad that you have that understanding. So I just try to get people to think about that. Some people don't think about it like you're thinking about it. They think about it like the IVF industry talks about it, and say, well, it's our property. They're not property, they're children.
I mean, it technically is, though, because you're renting space to store them.
Right.
So technically, yeah, it is.
Right, but that's also human life. So
I understand.
You agree with that? You
Yeah,
agree with
I'm
that.
not arguing.
Right. And so that's what I'm just explaining what we do. And so I'll say to them, what are your plans? Have you thought about it? And sometimes they'll tell me.
But you haven't told me what you're trying to do.
I'm
You're just trying to raise awareness that frozen embryos are children. That's it.
No, I'm trying to get people. Yes, there's that for sure. And then another part of it is to get people to consider, if they haven't thought about what they're going to do with those in cryogenic storage,
what they're going to do with those human lives, because a lot of them get abandoned. That's something the IVF industry admits in mainstream media. They say that they have a problem with it. There's millions of these embryos in frozen storage.
I'm sure.
So many of them get abandoned because eventually people stop paying for the storage or whatever, and so it's a real problem if we believe that they're human beings.
Right. So now that we're in agreement that we're on the same page here, what are you here trying to do?
We're trying to. What I'm trying to do is convince other people that they need to make sure that they're doing everything that they can to make sure those human lives are taken care of. And I'm also trying to help people understand that through the process, there's embryos that are lost all along the way. So whether by attrition in the earliest stages, by selective reduction later.
But so are you standing out here accusing people of, because it says babies are murdered here.
Right.
So
it's not, what I'm saying is the
because
idea.
that's actually the false of what happens inside. Have you ever been in there? Have you ever gotten any knowledge from in there?
What I've talked to.
Do you have any experience in it? I'm asking. You're asking me questions.
Would you like me to answer your question?
Yeah.
Then let me answer. I've done a lot of research on it.
No, I didn't ask if you've done research. I've asked if
I
you've been in there.
can't know anything unless I've been in there. Is that what you're saying?
That's I asked the question.
No,
had you been in there?
No, I haven't.
That's
Are you
simple
saying?
no.
Are you saying that I can't know anything?
No,
Unless
I'm
I've been
saying
in there?
that you got on the internet to do your research.
That's people research things. That's how you do research.
Okay, but that's my point. Just because you get on the internet and read something, that means it's true.
When you read, hold on. So, hold on just a second. So, the research that I've done is from their material, not material I look at for the people that are saying what I'm saying. I've looked at their websites. I've looked at NIH. I've looked at CDC.
Okay.
I've looked at all those. I'm talking about facts. And the facts are that when it comes to IVF, you create human lives.
Correct.
In the early stages, many of them die by attrition, right? They just die because they don't develop as they should. And so there's a certain number that die at that
So
stage.
are you accusing, because we've had miscarriage, so are you accusing me?
Miscarriage isn't the same thing as
you just said they didn't make it. What's the difference in that and a miscarriage?
The difference is God's in control of miscarriage.
God's in control of how many eggs my wife was able to produce.
Right.
He was in control of how much sperm I was able to produce. What's the difference?
The difference.
Do you know? You don't even know why we're here. There's reasons why people are here.
I know. I've done that research. I know. I'm not. Listen.
No, but when you put signs out there like that, that groups me in that category, and I don't like it.
Okay. But you were asking me questions. I'm trying to give you the answer. You don't have to like my answer, but I'm giving you the answer. So the answer is that there's embryos that die in the early stages. There's also embryos that this is on them. The embryos later that get up to a certain point, they grade them. The top two grades are the only ones that make it to either transfer or being frozen, right? And so those that aren't meeting that standard are either destroyed or donated to science. These are human lives that are being destroyed or donated to science. That's a problem. I mean, you said you agree with me that it's a human life.
Right.
That's the issue.
Oh, I wish I was here by myself. I'd stand out here and argue with y'all all day. I know my wife's calling me right now, so I'm going to walk away.
I understand.
I expected this to go way different. I will tell you.
Right.
I'm not saying I walked over here expecting confrontation.
Right.
But I was.
Sure.
So
I understand why.
This win is great.
I appreciate
you.
you.
I mean, honestly,
Good.
like I said, because as I was walking over here, I fully expected the confrontation.
Yeah.
So, again, I just don't like being categorized like that.
Yeah.
And I understand you're not necessarily putting me in that circle.
Right.
But at the same time, you are.
Yeah, I hear what you're.
And I personally take offense to that.
Yeah.
Because, like we said, you people walk out thinking one thing, knowing nothing.
Yeah.
Whatever. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah,
because
I
she's
hear
calling
you.
me twice now.
Okay.
But you know what I mean. Like
Yeah.
when I make comments like, "No, those are my children."
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
obviously, I understand things different than other people, right?
Right.
So again, this went way different than I thought it was
Good.
going to.
Good. Well, I'm glad.
And y'all have every right to do what you're doing.
I appreciate you.
And I know you said you weren't harassing, but I've been told from people that it felt like harassment.
I know. I know.
That's part
Hey,
of why I walked
I
out
appreciate.
like I
My
did.
name's John.
John Masonier.
Nice to meet you,
Yeah.
man.
Booklets are written by Senator Dusty Devers. If you want to look into it, it has
Okay.
more information. I figure it was worth a shot.
I was just trying not to get punched. The only thing I'm trying to show with that is like
that gets heated sometimes. And then you'll notice in that conversation where it turned. Where it turned was when we were talking about the issue of how many embryos are destroyed. So he admitted early on that this is human life. Very important if you're going to talk to somebody about it to start. When I started going out there, I just asked a lot of questions. Like, I would a lot of times just ask, are you pro-life? And in Texas, a lot of people will say yes. And so then I'll say, well, do you believe that life starts at fertilization? That's a very important question to ask early. If they say yes, and almost all of them do, which at a fertility clinic, of course they all do. Why are they there? They're there because they know it. What else are you doing? You're trying to get a human life. So when you establish that, then from there, it becomes a lot easier. That's the main thing to know. Like whether you're standing in front of a fertility clinic or whether you're talking to someone that's in your family or in your church, that's where you start. And that is so well established within the context of embryology that life starts at fertilization, like something like 96% or something of OBGYNs believe that, according to the American Medical Association. So that is reality. So you start there. Let's go ahead and just point out some basic things about apologetics on the sidewalk. When you're out there, you be gentle. And remember what we looked at in 1 Samuel. If you've never gone through infertility, just remember that there's real pain. The pain is real. And so you do want to be gentle and ask the questions. Ask gentle questions. And I always like the phrase, of those. So I'll ask, how many eggs did you have fertilized in your cycle? And they usually can tell you. And then I'll ask, of those, how many of them survived to the point where they could be graded? And they can usually tell you. And then I'll say, of those that graded high enough, how many of them were transferred? And how many were frozen? Of the ones that were frozen, how many of those survived thaw? Of the ones that transferred, how many of those successfully transferred? And they can always tell you exactly how many, because they know that these are human lives. When they begin the process, fertility doctors will often tell them, you need to have mental health professionals to help you through this process. Why? Is my question. If they're just clumps of cells and they're not human lives like a lot of people will claim, why do you need a mental health professional? No, they know that these are human lives. They want very much to have a child, and they can tell you how many have been lost through every single stage. And then I'll ask, of the ones that were successfully transferred, of those, how many became live births? And so what I'm trying to show them just by asking that series of questions is to help them see and let their conscience speak to them how much human life has been sacrificed. And the only reason I didn't do this because I'm a really smart guy. I'm not. The reason I did it was because the first time I went to a fertility clinic, I was absolutely scared to death. I had no idea how to do this. And so I just asked a lot of questions. And by doing the question process, I learned this is really the best way to help them see it. When you go stand in front of an abortion clinic, it's really easy. Like, they're murdering babies. Don't do that. You know what I mean? But when they come to a fertility clinic, they're trying to have a child. So how in the world am I going to breach that gap? It happens with questions. Handout literature, you saw it in the video. We'll just offer it, and all I'll say is, here's something on what the Bible has to say about infertility. That's really not that confrontational. Certainly not as confrontational as standing out in front of an abortion clinic. Come talk to us about what the Bible has to say about infertility. And I was surprised early on how many, and I still am surprised, how many will come over and take the information. When we hand it out, we hand out Dusty's booklet. We hand out a Build-A-Baby drop card that's out there on the table. By the way, all of that stuff on the Choice for Two table, none of it is for sale. All of it is for free. And when I go up to Canada next week, I'm getting resupplied. So take everything. You know, you can, like, if you use it, take it, okay? And there's some gospel tracts on there. Everything on there you can take. Eventually, if you do it, you need to eventually expect the same treatment that you get at abortion mills. Eventually, once they get used to you being out there,
Then they start doing some of the same things. They'll start turning on the sprinklers. You know, they do that to you here. They've done a thing in Texas when it's gotten cold enough to freeze. They turn the sprinklers on overnight so that the whole sidewalk is just glazed ice. They'll swerve their cars at you when they're coming in the parking lot. They've even got like sort of an escort system like you have in a lot of abortion clinics where they have escorts who come. They call them descorts, you know, those of you that do it. And they'll have people that walk them out to the car so they don't have to talk to us. It's a lot of the same things. They'll call the cops and accuse you of all kinds of things that you haven't done. It's all, and that's why we film everything. I actually do more filming at the IVF clinics than I did at the abortion clinics because of protection. Expect spiritual warfare. It's child sacrifice. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. Doctrines of demons. You're sacrificing to demons. And I didn't do it. This is one weakness of that video. I didn't get a chance to share the gospel in that video, but there's been a lot of great gospel opportunities when we're standing out there in front of the clinic. And that's really what you want to do. You want to get to a place where you're saying, I've had them say, when I walk them through by asking questions, they'll turn around and say, wait a minute, are you saying this is sinful? And their conscience, right? The conscience bears witness. We're showing them that this is murder. And their conscience bears witness. And so then it's a great opportunity to begin just to share the gospel with them in that context. So,
this is something that I've wondered, and especially from like a pastoral perspective, when you have people coming up and asking you, you've answered a lot of those things that I initially even asked Pastor Mark in our meetings is, we know what goes on at the abortion clinics, that's easy, but sometimes the perspective you have to overcome will be the ones at the abortion clinic who are thinking they're doing something good, and that aren't we Christians, aren't we about life? So that's the difficult hump to get over. But pastorally, as we're counseling people, my understanding, and I've heard it presented by people, was that there's an option for Christians to mandate that the people doing the procedure would only take one egg and only take one sperm. Can you speak to that on the scientific side? I do understand, and you'll probably go into it as the weekend goes on, about the theological perspective about marital union, taking God out of the equation, all those things that have theological implications, but just on the scientific, is there a possibility for people to be like, I only want one sperm and one egg, and that's the ethical way to do it? Can you speak to that?
Sure, yeah. I have said in the past that largely speaking as a whole, like in terms of like a whole, if you're looking at the whole industry, generally speaking, you'll have people that will claim that, and then you start asking some of these questions, and then you find out that's not really true at all. And what they're really thinking about is the fact that they transferred one embryo at a time. And so you have to ask questions again, like how many eggs were fertilized. You have to get specific when people make the claim on the one hand. And I'll often say it's often an urban myth, it's an urban legend that this exists. So it's not entirely true, because there is a thing called natural cycle IVF, where they will take one, fertilize one, hopefully, and then transfer one. And so, but the problem with it is that it's way less successful than normal IVF. There's a couple of things that happen with this. The one is that the IVF clinics don't want to do it. Yes, it's an option. They could do it, but they don't want to do it because they got to report cycles to the if they report to the CDC, they got to report cycles. That one egg counts as a cycle. So when people research fertility clinics to see who has the best success rate, and they're doing this, it doesn't work as much, they will counsel against it heavily. Like they will heavily, like, no, you want me to lose my my business by doing this? So the ones that just don't care about ethics, there are some that do it. There's one in New York City that does it, but it's not successful. And the thinking is it's also not as expensive. So, okay, so I tried it once, it didn't work, but I'm going to try it again because it's cheaper. So I still haven't paid as much as a normal cycle, so I'm going to do it again. And so they just keep repeating that process. Well, what happens? It still has a higher failure rate, and so you're creating human lives, and they're dying by attrition. So again, we're talking about culpability. Who's culpable in that situation? Again, paperwork is signed. Again, money is paid. and you're knowingly doing it. So I came up, I did an interview with World Magazine a couple of weeks ago, and they printed an article. They're about to do a follow-up, and they were asking me about this. And I said it's a difference between playing Russian roulette with your kid and a school shooting. Like regular IVF is a school shooting. Like you got a number of dead babies. With this natural cycle, you're playing Russian roulette every single time with these eggs, and whether they live or die. And so I still think it's a problem. Now I know they claim, but again, if you're talking to someone, it's where you ask that question: how many times did you do it before you had a successful birth? And a lot of times they'll write it off, well, it wasn't viable. Well, you created that human life. If it's successfully fertilized and then died, you're still accountable for that. So I know that's a harsh way of answering it, but I honestly think that people really need to face these facts, and they need to think it through a little further. Ethical IVF, when people talk about it, generally they just mean one embryo transferred at a time. And they're not thinking about all those other ones that they just write off as, well, they weren't viable. Well, if they were fertilized, those were human lives. And we have to really clarify in the discussion. Yes, sir.
So wouldn't they, in regards to ethical IVF, wouldn't they argue that one, sorry. So in regards to ethical IVF, all right, what you were just saying, wouldn't they just argue or say that would be the same as having a miscarriage?
Yeah.
Just one, a miscarriage. That's not my fault.
Right. But
God's
the problem
sovereign,
is,
it happened.
But again, it's culpability. Like when you had your miscarriage, you weren't signing papers involving, a technician, to create that to happen. And that's where I really believe you got to hold firm to that, because they're knowingly creating that human life. And when you're knowingly doing that, and you know that there's that high risk in that 1-to-1-to-1, then I believe you're accountable in that case. We're not accountable like in the natural. When you look, I can't remember the statistics. It's very high. The number of failed embryos in a regular pregnancy. I just looked at it the other day. I read it for the first time. It's high, 70%. There's a lot of natural miscarriage that takes place in regular human reproduction. But it's a lot different when you are contracting with someone to do it, legally.
Because I would see like families and couples that have had multiple miscarriages, and they're just still trying, and they're still trying, and there's a 80% failure rate or 90. I mean, this baby's going to be miscarried, but they try and try and try, and miscarry. Yep. It's almost the same equation, or in my mind, or my thought process, if I was going on the other side in favor of it, that I would argue and say that.
Right. Well, in the end, we look at the sovereignty of God, and He's the one that's sovereign over. But what we know is that human reproduction is blessed by God, in the Word of God. The marriage bed is undefiled. So those things we leave to the sovereignty of God within the context of a God-ordained method of reproduction. But when we have something that's completely outside of that, then, it's another whole thing, right? Yeah. It's a good These are all great questions, and they do come up.